Hey folks, in this video we are going to be looking at Buddhism versus Thelema. We're going to compare them in terms of their morality, their technologies of awakening, their aesthetics, and in terms of their ultimate purposes. Let's get started. In this video, I'm going to compare and contrast Thelema and Buddhism along 4 different points: morality, technologies of awakening, aesthetics, and ultimate purpose. Now, I'm not going to cover all the different kinds of Buddhism, just like I'm not going to cover every single interpretation of Thelema that there is. It's just impractical. I'm going to restrict it to Theravada Buddhism, just because that's the kind of Buddhism that I'm most familiar with. So in Theravada Buddhism, you have 5 moral precepts. You have to abstain from taking life. You have to abstain from taking what is not given to you. You are to abstain from sexual misconduct. You are to abstain from false speech, which, believe it or not, includes sarcasm, which means that if I were a Buddhist, I would be completely. And finally, you're to abstain from liquor, wines, drugs, and other intoxicants. Now, if you go into a meditation retreat context, the prohibition against sexual misconduct is expanded into an oath of celibacy. And in addition to that, you have 3 other precepts. You are not to eat after noon. You're not to engage in any kind of singing, dancing, listening to instrumental music, or wearing of jewelry, perfumes, or cosmetics, or anything like that. And you are not to use any high or luxurious beds or seats. Now, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with any of these precepts necessarily, but it kind of raises the question of like, well, why would you follow them in the first place? I remember being on a meditation retreat at one point, and one of the people leading the retreat said something to the effect of, well, the Buddha wasn't really anti-sex. He just wanted you to remain aware of what the sexual impulse was, which is just complete nonsense. The Buddha thought sex was bad, and that's just that person was just giving a modern, kind of postmodern liberal interpretation of what all this was. So the Buddhist ethics are based upon the Buddha's worldview, which the best way I can explain it is with an analogy. Imagine you're shooting down the freeway at 100 miles an hour in a car, and you're in the back seat of that car. And you look up front, and there's not even anybody driving the car. The car is just driving itself. And inevitably, the car is going to crash into something, and you're going to die horribly in an inferno. And then the whole thing's going to reset, and you're going to be back in the same car, and you get to just do this again and again for all of eternity. Shooting down 100 miles an hour in a car, no control, dying horribly. And so the sort of Buddhist project, the spiritual project, is getting out of that car. Now, you can't just jump out of the car like John McClane when the thing's going 100 miles an hour. You got to slow the thing down to 0, and then you can open up the door and you can get out of the car. Now, the purpose of Buddhist ethics is to take that car down from about 100 miles an hour down to, let's say, 20 miles an hour. And then to get the car to go from 20 miles an hour down to 0, you have subtler techniques like meditation, for example, that'll bring it to a standstill. But the ethics are sort of like, that's the 20% of work you do to get 80% of the result, so to speak. And the problem is that if you don't believe that life is like being in an out-of-control car going 100 miles an hour, it actually doesn't really make a lot of sense why you would want to follow Buddhist ethics in the first place. It kind of takes away the rationale for it. And the other problem is that when you look at how we interpret Buddhism in the West, it's very much focused on meditation. And it's not really clear that meditation was supposed to be able to do as much for people as we think. Because remember, it was only taking us down that last 20 miles an hour. So that's something we're actually going to come back to when we talk about technologies of awakening. Like, what exactly is meditation supposed to be accomplishing for us? Now, in contrast to all of this, Thalamic ethics might seem a lot more practical, because according to Thalamic ethics, any situation you find yourself in, there's only one course of action which is permissible, and that is the course of action which accords with your true will, which is something like what it is within your intrinsic nature to do at that very moment. And so it becomes very individualistic. Now, of course, there are a lot of commonalities across individuals. We are all members of the same species. We all share roughly the same kind of brain structure and hence psychology. So in a lot of situations, it's not going to be completely individual what you do, but it could be. And the main advantage of Thalamic ethics is that it's empirical. So for example, if you're on a meditation retreat and you're trying to get really good concentration, then how you ought to behave really just depends on what it takes for you personally to get your body calm, to get relaxed, and to get focused. If sexual abstinence is part of what you require to do that, then you should be abstinent. But if it's not, then there's really no intrinsic reason to do that. So I think from a modern perspective, Thalamic ethics makes more sense than Buddhist ethics because it doesn't require that weird sort of, being in a speeding car analogy to really grasp why you would do any of these things. The next point of comparison is what I call technologies of awakening. Now, the aim of both Buddhism and Thelema is the same. It's a state called samasamadhi, or right concentration, or sometimes it's just called samadhi. Samasamadhi is the culmination of the Noble Eightfold Path in Buddhism, and in Thelema, samadhi is called knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel. Now, the means that samadhi is achieved are different in Buddhism versus in Thelema. In Buddhism, the main technique is meditation, which is stilling or quieting the mind, whereas in Thelema, it is magic, which often involves visions and visualization and things like astral travel. Now, the statement I just made is slightly misleading because you actually have both of these techniques in both traditions. So for example, there's tons of magic in Buddhism and there is tons of meditation in Thelema as Crowley taught it. However, when you look at the Buddhist subculture, especially in North America, it's very much geared toward meditation and there's very little discussion of magic. And if you look at the Thalamic subculture, it's very much geared toward magic and occultism and there's relatively little discussion about meditation by contrast. So the advantage in Buddhism is that there is way more empirical evidence on meditation that's been put together. So you can find tons of people in the Buddhist subculture who have experienced samadhi and who can help you achieve samadhi. You can go find books that have been written about samadhi, both by monks from Asia and Westerners. You can find online forums dedicated to people talking about the intricacies of samadhi. You can easily find a teacher who will help you explore samadhi and experience samadhi. There have even been experiments done where scientists have put people in fMRI machines while they've experience samadhi or even nibbana, and they can find like the correlates in the brain where all of these things are happening. In the last century, there has just been an explosion of growth in understanding meditative technology and samadhi. So you're going to have a cornucopia of that in the Buddhist culture. By contrast, in Thelema, you're going to be hard-pressed to find even one person who has experienced samadhi, which is really kind of alarming because Crowley was clear again and again and again that knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel is definitely a type of samadhi. And you never hear about people talking about samadhi when they talk about their angel. It's always like, oh, my angel told me to do this and my angel told me to do that. And I'm sorry, but if you haven't experienced samadhi, that's just fantasy. You're just talking to your imaginary friend. I'm sorry, not sorry. That's what that is. And a lot of times you hear people say things like, oh, I had the experience, but it's too personal to share. And maybe that's true, but I'd be pretty careful. You might be talking to somebody who's just saying that to cover up a lack of actual experience. So the problem you're going to run into in Thelema is that it's really hard to follow a path. It's hard to find people who can help you with this. It just really hasn't been done that much there. So I think in this context, Buddhism is a lot better than Thelema. You're going to get a lot more help getting your way to samadhi because the trail hasn't only been blazed, it's really been turned into a highway at this point. So Buddhism definitely beats Thelema in terms of technologies of awakening. So now we turn to the issue of aesthetics. So both magic and meditation as techniques have the power to take you all the way to your goal, which is samadhi. But neither of those techniques is going to do anything for you unless you are able to really devote yourself to those practices. What I mean is you have to like or respect those traditions enough to be able to sit down every single day, rain or shine, whether you feel like it or not, and do them. In my experience, the number one predictor of success in any kind of spiritual path is a person's persistence. Can they commit to it? Can they commit to the path and follow it all the way through? I mean, sure, we could talk about meditation and magic in the abstract, whether this one works better or this one does, but if you don't actually do those practices with a high level of discipline, neither of them is going to do anything for you at all. And so a lot of it actually comes down to just sort of how you feel about the tradition. Are you attracted to the tradition enough? Does it do enough for you on a look and feel kind of level that you can commit to it? And that's not something that I or anyone else can answer for you. You have to really kind of figure that out for yourself. And so, that being a very individual and personal process, and there's nothing that I can say to you about that. I mean, certainly Buddhism and Thelema are very, very different aesthetically. And I recognized this early on. I actually started out in Buddhism, and I pursued Vipassana practice for years, and then I really liked the austerity of that approach, and I found it very analytical and very straightforward, but the austerity of it kind of grated on me after a while. And when I found magic, it was just like a breath of fresh air. It was like letting in all of these things that I was kind of missing out on before. And when I finally experienced my own realization, it was actually in the context of Thelema and in the context of doing magic. So I know that path works, but it really does come down to what are you willing to commit yourself to? What in your heart are you able to have that kind of devotion to? And so that's something that only you can answer for yourself. So we've compared Thelema and Buddhism according to morality, technologies of awakening, and their aesthetics. But there's one more factor I want to compare them on, and it's something that I almost never see discussed with regard to spirituality in general, which is, what is the purpose of all of it? Now, I was saying earlier that when Buddhism was brought from the East into the West, there was this whole problem with the morality, and it's like it makes it very difficult to understand like why you would follow the moral prescriptions that you would. And so usually what ends up happening is that the morality kind of gets kicked out or sidelined, and it is kind of replaced with sort of like a vague, like psychotherapeutic morality and postmodern ethics. And instead what people do is they lean really, really heavily on meditation, and they want meditation to do all these wonderful things for them. And so there's been like a lot of, in my opinion, really overblown claims about meditation's ability to, help you get your act together. I mean, clearly it has some benefits, but I think it gets overblown, and we kind of lean on it a little bit too much. And I've even known people who have used meditation and taken it all the way to awakening, and they reach a state of realization, and then they turn around and they say, like, I don't even know what the point of any of this was. Like, as hard as it is to believe, like, you can reach the ultimate end of a spiritual path, or what looks like the ultimate end, and not have any purpose for it, or even wonder why you did it. And I think the reason that happens is because when you have awakening occurring in the context of a tradition that's not whole, and it's not in its original context, you get there and it's not really clear what it was for. Like, it was never being done for the sake of the individual in the first place. I think it was supposed to be for something higher, but when the tradition isn't intact, it's virtually impossible to see what that is. Now, by contrast, I think Thelema is much, much better on this point, because the purpose of all these activities is really clearly spelled out again and again and again in Crowley's writings. Crowley saw Thelema as the continuation and development of a tradition which goes way back in time. He called it the Interior Order, he called it the Communion of Saints, he called it the AA, and he thought that it was actually responsible for forming the civilization that we find ourselves in. And so from Crowley's perspective, you're not doing all of these weird activities just for yourself. You're actually doing it for a higher purpose, which is linked up with the needs of mankind, the needs of civilization, the needs of regenerating the earth. He uses this kind of language a lot. Even the needs of the cosmos as a whole. So the whole thing is really geared toward these higher ends. And yes, some of it has to be focused on your individual self. Obviously, you can't help others if you haven't helped yourself, and that's obviously a focal point. But that's actually the first step in many steps that lead up to this sort of grander project of, that's happening at the level of civilization and the level of ecology and the level of the cosmos and so forth. And what you end up finding in contemporary Thelema instead is like this really heavy over-reliance on ideas of like my purpose, my true will, and it's always like very vague what's meant, or there's kind of like a vague notion of like balance, which doesn't really amount to anything. And the problem with this is like, it's very self-serving. It's kind of dislocated from that larger project that Crowley was talking about. But even at the level of being self-serving, it's like, it's not really, it doesn't even serve the individual that well. Like I don't usually see a lot of personal transformation taking place with these ideas. I don't usually see a lot of challenge going on. Like when somebody says like, oh, I'm doing my true will now, like usually they're doing something very similar to what they were doing before. Like you don't really see people like radically turning their lives around with this either. So I think even from the point of view of something being self-serving, I'm not even sure it actually accomplishes that either. And so I think that if Thelema has a future, it's going to involve a reorientation back toward those higher purposes that Crowley talked about. It's going to be a lot less about this kind of like my purpose in life and my angel telling me this and that and the other thing, and it's going to become much more about those sort of larger goals. And I don't think that Buddhism in the West really has that kind of advantage. I don't think it's really clear at all what purpose Buddhism is supposed to serve in the West. It's never really clearly spelled out. But I think potentially Thelema does have that at its core. So that is why I definitely side with Thelema on the issue of purpose. So I hope that video was helpful for you guys. If it was, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you feel so inclined, leave a comment. If you want to see more great content like this, be sure to hit subscribe. Talk to you next time.